Good evening, and welcome to tonight's calm corner of forgotten history, where the flicker of the past glows gently through the fog of sleep. If this is your first time here, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you in bed already? On the couch? Watching from a quiet train ride or listening under a heavy blanket while rain taps the windows? Wherever you are, I hope this gentle voice finds you safe, warm, and ready to drift slowly into rest. Because tonight, we're going back not just to any chapter of history, but to a misunderstood, mysterious, and often misrepresented age, the Middle Ages. Not the myths of knights in shining armor or damsels locked in towers, but the details in between the facts you won't hear in classrooms or see in Hollywood films. This series will take you through 50 little-known facts about the medieval world, divided evenly across 21 relaxing chapters, each revealing just a few quiet truths, the kind that feel like secrets kept safe for centuries. So breathe in, let your shoulders drop, and close your eyes if you like, as we begin with the very first three. Fact number 1. In the early Middle Ages, people often slept in 2 shifts. It wasn't uncommon for families to go to bed shortly after dusk, sleep for several hours, then wake sometime after midnight. This first sleep was followed by a calm period in the middle of the night used for prayer, quiet thought, even small household tasks or conversations before returning to bed for what was known as the second sleep. Many scholars believe this was due to natural circadian rhythms adjusting to darkness and limited artificial light. The custom faded only with the rise of modern street lighting and industrial timekeeping. But for centuries, the night was a gentle rhythm of pause and rest, wakefulness and return. Imagine candles flickering, firewood crackling, and low voices murmuring in a thatched home where the world outside had gone still. Fact number 2. Hygiene in medieval times wasn't what people often assume. While it's common to picture filthy streets and unwashed peasants, many medieval communities practiced regular bathing, especially in the earlier Middle Ages. In cities like Paris and London, public bathhouses were once a thriving part of urban life. In rural villages, people bathed in rivers or heated water in basins at home. Monasteries, in particular, had structured routines for cleanliness, including weekly or even daily washing. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, and although it was rough on the skin, it did the job. The idea that people in the Middle Ages never bathed at all is more myth than truth, a distortion born from later centuries when plagues and moral reforms changed attitudes toward bathing. In truth, the medieval world had its own standards of cleanliness, shaped by access, resources, and belief. Fact number 3. Cats were both beloved and feared in the Middle Ages. On one hand, they were kept in homes and farms to control mice and rats, valued for their quiet nature and hunting instincts. But on the other hand, cats, especially black ones, were often associated with witchcraft, heresy, or the supernatural. In some places, they were celebrated and cared for. In others, they were persecuted, even burned alongside accused witches. Pope Gregory IX once issued a papal decree linking black cats with devil worship, contributing to widespread fear that lasted for centuries. Ironically, when cats were killed in large numbers during times of superstition, rat populations surged, worsening the spread of plagues. The relationship between humans and cats in the medieval world was as complex as the age itself, part companionship, part caution, part folklore. And so, as you gently slip into a state of half-sleep, let these 3 quiet truths sit with you like lanterns in an old stone hall. A world of broken sleep and candlelight, of soap made with fire and patience, of cats watching from rooftops and thresholds. These are only the first of 50 moments we will uncover together. And as we continue, the forgotten Middle Ages may feel a little closer, quieter, slower, stranger, and more real than you remember. Now rest. Let the flickering past carry you softly into the night. The medieval world was not still. Though we often imagine it frozen in candlelight, cloaked in quiet stone, it pulsed with life in ways that modern eyes might overlook. Beneath wooden beams and within thick castle walls, people lived days full of order and chaos, faith and fear, and countless small moments that rarely make it into textbooks. Tonight, we turn to 3 more of these moments, brushing the surface of forgotten truths. Fact number 4. In many parts of medieval Europe, people believed that illness was caused not by germs or viruses, but by an imbalance of the body's 4 humors. These humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile were thought to govern health, mood, and personality. A cheerful person was believed to have more blood, a melancholic one more black bile. Physicians of the time diagnosed patients using a variety of curious methods: tasting urine, checking the color of the skin, examining the stars. Treatments included bloodletting with leeches or knives, herbal concoctions, or even changes in diet and behavior. While these ideas seem strange now, they were rooted in a desire to understand the body's rhythms, and they paved the way for centuries of study. Even in error, the medieval world was asking the right questions. Fact number 5. Medieval castles had toilets, but not like the ones we know today. Many had what were called garde-robes, small stone rooms that jutted out from the outer walls, often several floors up. Waste would simply fall through a hole, landing in a pit or moat below. Some castles even had multiple garde-robes side by side without any partition between them, making them more social than you might imagine. There were no flush mechanisms, but some castles had clever designs where rainwater could help wash things away. People might line the holes with hay or moss, or hang fragrant herbs nearby to mask the smell. In winter, the stone was cold enough to make the experience brief. In summer, flies were an uninvited guest. Yet, for its time, this was an engineering feat, a quiet, gravity-powered solution to an eternal human need. Fact number 6. In the Middle Ages, books were handmade treasures, often taking months or even years to produce. Before the invention of the printing press, every letter had to be written by hand on parchment animal skin that had been carefully stretched and dried. Monks in scriptoria copied religious texts with careful attention, sometimes adding colorful illustrations and decorative borders called illuminations. A single Bible could require the skins of hundreds of animals and the work of several scribes. The pigments used in illustrations came from minerals, insects, and even crushed gemstones lapis lazuli for deep blue, gold leaf for radiant accents. Books were so valuable that they were chained to desks to prevent theft. Ownership was a mark of extreme wealth or devotion, and within their covers, illuminated by flickering torchlight, the words of faith, law, science, and story found their shape. As you listen, imagine one of those books, its heavy leather cover, the scent of ink and parchment, the rustle of pages in a silent stone chamber. Somewhere, a monk leans over a wooden desk, dipping a quill into ink, shaping each letter with quiet purpose. History was written slowly, then patiently, deliberately, one curve at a time. Let that thought be your candle tonight. One page, one breath, one dream at a time. The further we travel into the folds of the medieval world, the more we begin to see it not as a single frozen time, but as a patchwork of centuries stitched together by quiet habits, distant fears, and everyday ingenuity. Time in the Middle Ages did not move as it does now. It curved and stretched with the seasons, bound more to the ringing of church bells and the shifting light than to clocks or calendars. To truly see this era, we have to slow ourselves to its rhythm. Let's continue, not with haste, but with patience, as we look closely at 3 more pieces of this historical tapestry. Fact number 7. Contrary to what many people believe, most medieval peasants were not constantly starving or living in misery. In fact, many had access to a surprisingly varied diet. A typical peasant might eat barley bread, pottage, a thick stew made of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat, and locally grown produce like onions, cabbage, or leeks. Meat was less common but not unheard of, especially during feast days or harvest celebrations. Dairy was a staple, with cheese and butter made regularly. Ale and small beer were safer to drink than water, and even children consumed weak brews as part of daily life. People preserved food by salting, smoking, or drying, and fermented foods provided both nutrition and flavor. While life was physically demanding, the idea of constant starvation is more myth than fact. In good years, the land gave enough, and when harvests failed, communal systems of aid, charity from monasteries, and mutual support helped many endure. The rhythm of sowing and reaping was sacred, tied to both the body and the spirit, and meals were moments of connection and gratitude. Fact number 8. One of the most misunderstood institutions of the Middle Ages is the medieval university. Founded in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, these early centers of learning were vibrant, chaotic places. Students were often young men sometimes, just 14 or 15, who came from across Europe to study philosophy, law, medicine, and theology. Classes were conducted entirely in Latin, and lectures consisted of professors reading aloud from ancient texts while students took notes and asked questions. There were no formal grades, and exams could be brutal oral defenses lasting hours. Universities had their own rules, separate from local laws, and student riots were not uncommon. Despite these wild edges, the pursuit of knowledge was sincere and serious. Libraries were guarded treasures, and to be a master of arts or theology was to dedicate one's life to study. The notion that the Middle Ages were anti-intellectual vanishes when you imagine hundreds of young scholars debating Aristotle in candlelit halls, poring over manuscripts, and walking cobbled streets in threadbare robes with their minds fixed on metaphysics. Knowledge even then was power. Fact number 9. The role of women in the Middle Ages was far more complex than often portrayed. While legal and social limitations were many, women were not entirely voiceless or powerless. Noble women could manage estates, act as regents in the absence of husbands, and play key roles in diplomacy. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded immense influence, leading armies and supporting artists. In towns and villages, women worked as bakers, brewers, midwives, weavers, and merchants. In some guilds, they held full membership and trained apprentices. Nuns preserved texts, ran schools, and maintained hospitals. Though excluded from universities and official positions of power, women found ways to shape the world around them through family, economy, and faith. Marriage was often a contract, arranged for alliance and property, but personal relationships varied widely. Letters, wills, and diaries show emotional depth, wit, and resilience. And in the realm of folklore and legend, women were healers, saints, witches, and warriors. Their stories some erased, some preserve a deco through time not as shadows, but as strong and quiet threads that held entire communities together. As we rest with these truths tonight, let them remind us that the Middle Ages were not a monolith. They were not only castles and cathedrals, but kitchens and fields, markets and manuscript rooms. In every village, a woman bent over a cradle or a ledger. In every lecture hall, a boy struggled to pronounce Cicero. In every mealtime prayer, a farmer gave thanks for barley and rain. It was an age of layered humanity, one that whispers instead of shouts. And if you close your eyes now, maybe you can feel the warmth of a hearth in a stone cottage, hear the low murmur of Latin through an open university window, or see a woman's hands shaping bread before sunrise. These are the truths that sleep beneath the armor and the myths, waiting to be remembered gently. In the quiet unfolding of time, history is not measured by great wars or crowned rulers alone, but by the soft, unnoticed rhythms of life that continue through centuries, the flicker of a candle over parchment, the hush of footsteps on frozen earth, the weight of silence after the last church bell echoes into the night. The Middle Ages were full of those rhythms. Moments between moments, stories behind the stories. It is there, in the stillness beneath armor and icon, that we find the truths often lost. And so we continue, deeper now, with 3 more facts to guide this passage through memory. Fact number 10. Pilgrimages in the medieval world were not just religious journeys, they were entire lifetimes in motion. While today we might think of pilgrimage as a metaphor, for people in the Middle Ages, it was as real as stone. Pilgrims set out on foot, often with little more than a walking staff, a woolen cloak, and a handful of coins sewn into their garments. They traveled for months or even years, heading towards sacred sites like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. Along the way, they faced bandits, illness, language barriers, and harsh weather. Yet these journeys were acts of devotion, penance, or desperation. Some were assigned as punishment for crimes. Others were lifelong dreams or family obligations. Inns and hospitals sprouted along routes to care for them, churches offered blessings, and badges made of pewter were collected like holy souvenirs. The scallop shell of Santiago became one of the most iconic. Some pilgrims never returned, choosing instead to live near the shrine they reached. In a time when most people never left their villages, pilgrimage was both a spiritual act and a radical departure, test of faith, endurance, and transformation. Fact number 11. The medieval clock was not like ours, and time itself flowed differently. Before the widespread use of mechanical clocks, the day was divided by natural events: sunrise, noon, sunset, the tolling of bells. Monasteries followed the liturgy of the hours, marking time with prayers. Matins in the dead of night, lauds at dawn, vespers as light faded. In cities, church towers rang bells to guide workers and merchants. But these hours were unequal, longer in summer, shorter in winter. It wasn't until the 14th century that public clocks began appearing in town squares, with weight-driven mechanisms and iron hands. Even then, they often rang only the hours, not the minutes. Life was lived in broader strokes, measured by seasons, by sowing and reaping, by feasts and fasts. People didn't speak of 2:30 p.m. They spoke of after Mass or before the shadows touched the wall. This different sense of time shaped everything: work, worship, sleep, and story. It made patience not just a virtue, but a way of life. Fact number 12. The medieval mind was steeped in symbolism, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the art and architecture of cathedrals. These buildings were not merely places of worship. They were stone sermons, teaching tools for the illiterate masses. Every column, statue, and stained glass window carried meaning. Gargoyles served not just as rainspouts, but as reminders of sin and protection. Saints were portrayed with objects that told their stories. St. Peter with keys, St. Catherine with a wheel. The rose windows that crowned the great facades were mathematical wonders, filled with color and geometry, meant to reflect the divine order of the universe. Builders worked without modern blueprints, relying on experience, apprenticeships, and geometric ratios. The construction of a single cathedral could span generations. Some workers began laying stones as children and died before the roof was complete. To walk into a cathedral like Chartres or York Minster was to enter a universe of meaning, a library carved in stone and glass. Light passed through colored panes not just to illuminate, but to inspire, to teach, to awe. It was the medieval internet, a place where images spoke to those who could not read, where faith and knowledge met in architecture. Let these images live softly in your thoughts tonight. A pilgrim walking alone with a wooden cross dangling from his belt, dust on his boots, eyes fixed on the horizon. A monk rising at midnight to sing praises by candlelight, his breath fogging in the chill of a stone cell. A mason pressing his hand against a freshly carved block, aligning it with ancient math passed down by whispers. Time was different then. Truth was shown through story and symbol. And faith was not a moment, it was the path, the bell, the stone. Let these echoes fill the silence between your thoughts now. Let them rock you gently, like footsteps on an old, forgotten road, until sleep gathers around you like the cloak of a traveling pilgrim beneath a silver sky. There is something deeply human in the way history fades show. We forget what was once normal, how the thrum of ancient lives is buried beneath modern silence. The Middle Ages whisper still, though, if one is quiet enough to listen. Not through the clamor of kings or the clash of swords, but through quieter truths. The creak of a spinning wheel, the echo of prayers in a cold chapel, the glint of candlelight on an ink-stained thumb. These are the sounds beneath the centuries, and tonight, they continue to speak. Fact number 13. Contrary to the cold images we often see in film, medieval clothing was not always drab or rough. In fact, the materials, dyes, and fashions of the Middle Ages were often vibrant, regional, and highly symbolic. The wealthy wore wool, yes, but also imported silks, linens, and even cloth of gold. Bright reds were made from madder root or imported Kermes beetles. Deep blues came from woad or lapis lazuli, and yellows from weld flowers or saffron. Clothing announced one's status. Peasants were even restricted by sumptuary laws from wearing certain colors or materials reserved for nobility. Men wore tunics, hose, and cloaks. Women's dresses were layered and could be elaborately embroidered. Buttons were rare early on but became more common by the 14th century. Headwear told stories to veils for modesty, pennons for prestige, hoods for travelers. And shoes evolved from leather wraps to more tailored designs, some even absurdly long at the toe, called poulaines. Even peasants might decorate garments with patchwork, dye, or hand stitching. Clothes were not disposable, they were repaired, passed down, and repurposed. To dress was not just to cover, but to express, protect, and communicate. Every thread was a sentence in a language we've nearly forgotten. Fact number 14. Music in the Middle Ages was not a rare luxury, it was woven into the very pattern of daily life. From the chants of monks at dawn to the songs of laborers in fields, music shaped sacred and secular experience. Gregorian chant, with its calm, flowing tones, filled monasteries with rhythm and reverence. It was sung in Latin, without instruments, a cappella, and was considered not performance but prayer. Outside the cloister, traveling minstrels and troubadours composed ballads, sang of courtly love, and passed news through rhyme and melody. Instruments included harps, lutes, rebecks, flutes, and bagpipes. Some were handmade, carved by the musician himself. Music marked time, bells signaled prayers, horns called to battle or feast, and drums announced processions. Even in illness, music was prescribed to soothe the spirit. In cathedrals, early polyphony 2 or more, voices singing in harmony merged, and with it, a revolution in sound. Manuscripts such as the Codex Calixtinus or Carmina Burana preserved songs both sacred and bawdy. Music was memory. Music was medicine. And even the poorest villager might hum a song his grandmother taught him while tending goats beneath the same sky where church bells rang in the distance. Fact number 15. Medieval medicine may seem archaic, but it was often more systematic than we assume. Physicians operated within a framework of humoral theory, yes, but they also consulted detailed medical texts, many of which were preserved through Arabic translations. In fact, some of the most important medical knowledge came through contact with the Islamic world, especially in places like Spain and Sicily. Texts by Avicenna, Galen, and Hippocrates were translated, debated, and copied. Hospitals existed as early as the 10th century, not only as places of last resort, but as centers of healing run by monks and nuns. Barbers doubled as surgeons, performing tooth extractions, minor surgeries, and even amputations. Bloodletting, though common, was done according to charts that aligned veins with the stars. Herbal remedies were widespread: willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, lavender for sleep. Women were especially important in medicine. They served as midwives, herbalists, and caregivers, with knowledge passed down orally and in manuscripts. One such manuscript, the Trotula, was a compendium of women's health practices written in the 12th century. It offered advice on fertility, childbirth, and cosmetics. Medical practice varied wildly between village and university, between superstition and scholarship. Yet at its heart, it showed a desire to understand suffering and relieve it, a very human pursuit, still alive in today's hospitals. So now, as we rest in the stillness of this story, imagine the colors of a woolen gown stitched carefully by firelight, the sound of a flute echoing across a dewy morning, or the firm voice of a nun reciting a recipe for healing a fever using herbs from her convent's garden. These were not shadows, they were lives. They were choices and chances and traditions wrapped in breath and hope. They are not gone. They are only waiting for silence long enough to speak again. There is a kind of wisdom in slowness, a way of understanding that cannot be rushed. The Middle Ages moved not with the ticking of modern clocks, but with the hush of snowfall on a monastery roof, the slow turning of parchment in a candlelit scriptorium, or the time it took for a pot of herbs to simmer on a hearth. These weren't just years, they were layers of life, each one pressed deep into the stone of a wall, the soil of a field, or the rhythm of a song. Tonight, as the quiet deepens around you, let us walk again into that long yesterday, uncovering 3 more truths carried gently through time. Fact number 16. Most medieval people, even peasants, had a surprisingly intimate relationship with animals, not just livestock for food or labor, but creatures woven into daily life in ways both practical and emotional. Chickens were everywhere, not only for eggs, but as alarm clocks and sources of gossip. Pigs roamed freely in many towns, eating scraps and sometimes entering homes. Cats, while sometimes associated with superstition, were also treasured for their rodent hunting abilities, and even kept by nuns in cloisters. Dogs varied from shaggy herding breeds to pampered lap dogs, especially among nobles. Horses were status symbols as much as tools of work or war. But beyond that, medieval bestiaries illustrated books of animals imbued each creature with spiritual or moral symbolism. The lion represented Christ, the owl, wisdom or deceit, the fox, cunning. These books weren't science as we know it, but mirrors of the human soul reflected in fur and feather. People believed that animals held signs, that their behaviors could foretell weather, illness, even death. And yet, they were loved to given names, fed by hand, mourned when they died. The boundary between human and animal was softer, and to live in the Middle Ages was to live among beasts, not above them. Fact number 17. One of the most curious aspects of medieval life was the complex relationship people had with bathing and hygiene. It's often claimed that people in the Middle Ages were filthy, but this is an oversimplification. In reality, bathing customs varied widely by region, time, and class. In some periods, public bathhouses were common and popular, especially in places like southern Germany, France, or the Islamic parts of Spain. Bathhouses were social spaces, sometimes gender-separated, sometimes mixed, where people came not just to wash, but to talk, eat, and relax. Wooden tubs were filled with hot water, often perfumed with herbs like rosemary or mint. People scrubbed with cloths, scraped their skin with curved tools, and even used early forms of soap made from ash and animal fat. Monasteries often had rules about regular washing, especially of hands and feet. However, during outbreaks of plague or moral panics, bathing fell out of favor, especially in the later centuries, when water was feared to open the pores to disease. Despite this, daily grooming remained important. Combs, toothpicks, nail knives, and linen towels were widely used. Scented sachets were worn beneath clothing to mask odor. Medieval people may not have bathed as often as modern ones, but they were far from careless about cleanliness. It was just framed differently, more symbolic, more seasonal, more rooted in the rhythm of nature. Fact number 18. Justice in the Middle Ages was a blend of law, custom, and community memory, and it looked very different from what we might expect. Courtrooms were often open-air gatherings, with decisions made by local lords, councils, or assemblies of freemen. Trials could be based on witness testimony, but they might also involve ordeals, ritual tests believed to reveal divine judgment. The ordeal of hot iron, for example, involved carrying a heated rod. If the wound healed cleanly, the accused was seen as innocent. Trial by combat, though rare, allowed disputes to be settled by duel, even for legal cases. Yet these practices began to fade by the 13th century, replaced by more structured systems. Charters were written, court rolls kept, and royal judges traveled the countryside holding assizes. Punishments were harsh. Thieves might be branded or mutilated, but there was also restorative justice. A thief might be fined or required to make public penance. The community played a key role. Neighbors vouched for character, collective memory shaped outcomes, and justice was as much about balance as retribution. Church courts handled moral and spiritual crimes, like adultery or heresy, and offered more lenient sentences like pilgrimage or fasting. Justice wasn't blind in the Middle Ages, it was communal, emotional, and often tied to one's reputation. In small villages, everyone knew each other's stories, and that knowing shaped what was fair. So imagine now the quiet weight of a pig nuzzling its way through a morning market, a monk rinsing his hands before morning prayer with cool spring water, or a village gathered under a great oak tree, watching a dispute be judged not with gavels, but with gestures, oaths, and trust. These moments, small, strange, intimate, formed the real fabric of the medieval world. And they drift now, not as grand epics, but as soft, slow truths meant to be felt more than understood. As we drift deeper into the slow current of medieval time, it becomes clearer that this was a world not defined by darkness, but by nuance. The shadows that have long covered the Middle Ages come not from the era itself, but from our distance from our tendency to glance quickly instead of looking slowly. But here, in the quiet, we can allow ourselves to linger, to notice the warmth in stone, the story in silence. And as the candle burns low beside us, 3 more forgotten truths rise gently to the surface. Fact number 19. Education in the Middle Ages was not reserved only for the elite. While formal schooling was rare for peasants, many children across Europe learned to read and write, especially if they lived near monasteries or cathedrals. The church played a central role in education. Monks and priests taught Latin, grammar, arithmetic, and music. Children sang psalms before they ever saw an alphabet. In cathedral schools, students practiced recitation, debate, and memorization. Books were rare and expensive, copied by hand, often chained to desks in libraries. But knowledge was treasured. Even in villages, local priests might teach basic literacy. Some noble women were educated, writing letters and keeping household accounts. Girls in nunneries learned scripture, Latin, and embroidery, considered both art and meditation. Traveling scholars moved between towns, sharing ideas. And in Islamic Spain, libraries flourished with thousands of texts in Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew, preserving science, philosophy, and poetry. To learn was to be close to God. Even illiterate peasants possessed deep oral knowledge of farming, weather, herbal medicine, and storytelling. Wisdom was not just written, it was spoken, sung, carved into tools, baked into bread, passed from hand to hand beneath centuries of stars. Fact number 20. Timekeeping in the Middle Ages followed the natural world more than mechanical devices. Before clocks became widespread, people told time by the position of the sun, the ringing of church bells, and the rhythm of daily labor. Monasteries used water clocks, candle clocks, and eventually early mechanical clocks to regulate the divine office, the prayers, set at regular intervals through the day and night. These prayers divided time into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour had its own light, its own mood, its own purpose. Bells called monks to prayer and farmers to work. In towns, bell towers told the passing of hours. Market days, feast days, and saint days provided larger anchors in time's river. People did not ask, "What time is it?" but "Is it before vespers?" or "After the second bell?" The first mechanical clocks appeared in the 13th century, often installed in churches or towers. They had no faces, just gears and hammers that struck bells. They were miracles of iron and ingenuity, and though they made time more measurable, they also made it feel differentless, about feeling and more about counting. Still, even in clock cities, people lived by the sun, the wind, the church, and the harvest. Time was not a number, but a presence. It walked alongside you rather than ahead of you. Fact number 21. Medieval people had a complex relationship with dreams and sleep. They believed that dreams could be messages from God, warnings from demons, or reflections of the soul. Books like the Somniale Danielis offered interpretations. To dream of fire meant passion or destruction. Water, a journey, teeth falling out, death in the family. People prayed before bed, often reciting psalms or invoking saints for protection from nightmares. The night itself was not always one long sleep. Many practiced segmented sleep. They would sleep for a few hours, wake in the middle of the night for prayer, reading, or quiet talk, then return to sleep until dawn. This first sleep and second sleep was natural to their rhythm. Beds were often shared not just by couples, but by siblings, children, or servants. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. Curtains or canopies helped keep warmth in and spirits out. Sleep was not just rest, it was a spiritual space, a liminal world. People worried about what might visit them in the dark, from devils to restless souls, and they protected their dreams with crosses, charms, and whispered blessings. Yet sleep was also sanctuary, a retreat from cold and hunger, a time to dream of saints or summer fields. And now, as your own night deepens, perhaps you can hear it too. The echo of a church bell in the distance, the hush of parchment turning beneath a child's candle, or the soft exhale of someone asleep beside a hearth. In these quiet places, history is not gone, it is only resting. And when we listen closely enough, it stirs again, softly, like breath in the dark. The weight of time is soft in the Middle Ages. It rests like wool on the shoulders of shepherds, like dust on the ledges of cathedral windows, like breath caught in hymns sung by candlelight. As we continue through this forgotten world, we do not need to hurry. The past will meet us where we are. It will not vanish. It is patient. And so tonight, let us sit again by the fire of memory and gather 3 more stories, quiet and strange, about the world that once was. Fact number 22. Medieval medicine may seem primitive from today's perspective, but it was built on a complex system of theories, traditions, and observations. One of its core ideas was the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and derived from ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. Health was believed to come from the balance of these humors, and illness from their imbalance. Treatments included herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, bloodletting, and purging. Physicians examined urine C, full color, consistency, even taste to determine diagnoses. Astrology also played a major role. The position of stars influenced when surgeries were performed or herbs gathered. Apothecaries prepared mixtures of plants, minerals, and animal parts, some helpful, others questionable. While some ideas were misguided, many treatments were based on careful empirical knowledge passed down through generations. Monasteries preserved medical texts and operated infirmaries. Women, especially midwives and herbalists, provided essential care in villages. Surgery, though risky, was practiced by barber surgeons who set bones, treated wounds, and even performed trepanation, the removal of part of the skull, to treat head injuries or mental illness. Though lacking modern tools, medieval healers understood the body as deeply connected to nature, spirit, and cosmos. They treated not just symptoms, but the soul. Fact number 23. The concept of childhood in the Middle Ages was more nuanced than we often assume. While it's true that children often worked from a young age helping in fields, tending animals, assisting in workshops, they were not seen as miniature adults. Art, literature, and legal documents from the time show recognition of childhood as a distinct phase of life. Noble children were taught manners, languages, and writing. Peasant children learned skills through watching and doing. Toys existed: dolls made of rags or wood, toy knights, miniature tools. Games like tag, dice, and early versions of football were played in village greens. Schoolboys copied texts onto wax tablets or slates. Stories were told around the fire, both to teach and to comfort. Children were baptized soon after birth, seen as souls close to both God and danger. High infant mortality meant that many did not survive, and grief was real, if often unspoken. But joy existed, too, in laughter, in play, in small hands reaching for bread or learning to hold a quill. Childhood in the Middle Ages was tender and fleeting, wrapped in both love and vulnerability. Fact number 24. Architecture in the Middle Ages was more than stone and wood. It was a language of faith, power, and community. From humble timber homes to soaring cathedrals, each building told a story. Romanesque churches with thick walls and round arches gave way to Gothic cathedrals that reached toward heaven with pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and stained glass that painted light into color. These cathedrals were marvels of engineering and devotion, built over decades or centuries by teams of masons, sculptors, and laborers. Carvings of saints, beasts, and scenes from daily life adorned walls and columns, blending sacred and mundane. In castles, great halls held feasts and councils. Moats and towers spoke of defense and display. In towns, timber-framed houses leaned into narrow streets, their upper floors jutting outward. Thatched roofs, wattle and daub walls, and central hearths made even simple homes warm and functional. Architecture was tied to time. It responded to seasons, available materials, and communal needs. A village church might be the tallest structure for miles, a place of baptism, marriage, and burial, binding lives together. Buildings were not just shelters. They were symbols, memories, prayers in stone. And now, as you lie still, imagine the cool hush of a cathedral nave, your footsteps swallowed by centuries of echo. Picture a child running beneath a timber roof, a mother lighting a rushlight in the shadows, a mason carving a silent story into a block of limestone. These were the spaces where life unfolded, shaped by hand and hope. And though the world outside your window is different now, some of those walls still stand. They remember. They wait. If you listen closely, beyond the ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the world around you, you might hear something older, something slower. It is the sound of medieval time, drifting like mist across stone walls and wooden beams, circling hearths long grown cold, brushing against the pages of forgotten manuscripts. The Middle Ages live not only in books or ruins, but in memory's quiet corners. And as we move gently forward, 3 more facts rise from the silence, like stars emerging through a velvet sky. Fact number 25. In the medieval world, color held deep symbolic meaning. It was not just decorative, it was spiritual, emotional, powerful. Blue is associated with the Virgin Mary, representing purity, humility, and divine grace. Painters used ultramarine, derived from lapis lazuli, a stone imported from Afghanistan and more valuable than gold. Red stood for both love and martyrdom. It adorned the robes of kings and cardinals, and symbolized the blood of Christ and the passion of saints. Green represented fertility and rebirth, while black could denote humility, authority, or sorrow, depending on its context. Artists mixed pigments from minerals, plants, and insects, grinding, boiling, straining, transforming the natural world into sacred visions. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with gold leaf, reflecting candlelight as though touched by heaven. Stained glass windows told stories through color, filtering divine light into the eyes and hearts of worshippers. Every hue had weight, intention, memory. In a world often darkened by storms and smoke, color was a language of hope and eternity. Fact number 26. Music in the Middle Ages was not background, it was sacred breath. Gregorian chant, sung in Latin by choirs of monks, filled abbeys and cathedrals with slow, flowing melodies meant to elevate the soul. These chants had no harmony, no strict rhythm, just a river of sound, rising and falling like prayer itself. Instruments existed too: lyres, harps, flutes made of bone or wood, drums, bells. Minstrels traveled from castle to village, telling stories in song. Courtly love poems were set to melodies, praising beauty, lamenting longing. In taverns, people sang ballads of outlaws and lovers. In churches, organs groaned with centuries of dust and devotion. Music was used to heal, to teach, to remember. Troubadours in southern France composed in Occitan, crafting verses of delicate sorrow and fierce admiration. In monasteries, notation began to appear, neumes drawn above words to guide pitch. Music, like language, connected earth and spirit. It was ephemeral and eternal. Even now, if you close your eyes, you may hear the ghost of a psalm echoing down a stone corridor, carrying with it 1,000 years of prayer. Fact number 27. Travel in the Middle Ages was dangerous, slow, and yet surprisingly common. Pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, messengers, and even students walked roads that wound across forests, mountains, and kingdoms. Most people traveled on foot, some rode horses or donkeys. Wagons creaked with trade goods. Inns were rare and often unreliable. Travelers stayed in monasteries, hospices, or with strangers. Maps were symbolic, not accurate. Jerusalem often placed at the center. River crossings required ferries or bridges, some guarded by toll-keepers. Forests were places of beauty and dread, full of wolves, bandits, and mystery. Yet people moved. A tanner might walk to a nearby town for a fair. A scholar might journey across Europe to attend university. A woman might join a procession to a saint's shrine, seeking healing. And despite the perils, there was a quiet courage in such journeys, a trust in paths, in stars, in the kindness of fellow travelers. To travel in the Middle Ages was to surrender to uncertainty, to carry one's story on the soles of worn shoes, to pass through villages where no one knew your name and yet still offered bread and shelter. And now, as you rest, picture a road lit only by moonlight, winding between hedgerows and ruins. Hear the creak of a cartwheel, the distant bark of a dog, the crunch of boots on gravel. Someone walked here once. They carried hope in a bundle, prayer on their lips, and time in their shadow. Their journey, like yours, was slow and strange and still unfolding. In the hush of midnight, as the outside world falls quiet and your breath softens into rhythm, we step once more into the long corridor of the Middle Ages. Here, each stone holds a story, and each shadow has memory. History in this time does not speak in shouts, but in whispers through the rustle of robes, the scratch of quill on vellum, the hush of prayer and the cold morning air. Let us return again, gently, and find 3 more truths woven into the fabric of a forgotten world. Fact number 28. Literacy in the Middle Ages was not as rare as once believed, and the ability to read was a source of power, connection, and salvation. While full literacy was mostly confined to clergy and nobility, many lay people, especially in cities, could read at a basic level. Merchants read contracts, householders read religious pamphlets, and scribes copied legal documents. Guilds maintained written records, and literate women, especially in nunneries or noble families, kept journals, copied scripture, and penned letters. Books were precious, often chained to desks or stored in chests. The Book of Hours, a prayer book for lay people, became one of the most popular texts, filled with intricate illustrations and daily devotions. In monasteries, scriptoria echoed with the careful work of scribes illuminating manuscripts. Each letter a prayer, each page a labor of devotion. Literacy opened the gates of understanding not just of faith, but of law, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. To hold a book was to hold a mirror to the soul. Fact number 29. Medieval law was a complex, evolving system that varied widely across regions and centuries. Justice was not uniform, it depended on custom, tradition, and social status. Trial by ordeal was one early method. Suspects might carry hot iron or be plunged into cold water to determine guilt based on divine judgment. Over time, this gave way to more structured systems: royal courts, canon law, and town councils. The concept of common law began to emerge in England under Henry II, with traveling judges applying standardized rulings. In other places, law was deeply local. Peasant disputes were settled by village elders or manorial courts. Fines, oaths, and compensations were common punishments. Jails were rare and mostly used for holding, not sentencing. Women could appear in court, own property, and even act as plaintiffs or defendants, depending on region. The idea of precedent, of law recorded and cited, began to take shape. Legal documents were copied by hand and sealed with wax. Justice was both ritual and reason. Though often harsh by modern standards, medieval law was not without logic and always bound by a belief in order, honor, and the seen and unseen forces that governed life. Fact number 30. Monasteries were the beating hearts of medieval spiritual and intellectual life. More than places of prayer, they were centers of agriculture, healing, hospitality, and learning. Monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized work, study, and worship. Days were structured by the divine officiate prayers sung throughout the day and night. In between, monks copied texts, tended gardens, brewed ale, and treated the sick. Monasteries grew herbs for medicine, taught reading to local children, and housed pilgrims and travelers. They preserved classical knowledge, translating ancient Greek and Roman texts into Latin. Some were incredibly wealthy, managing lands and collecting rents. Others were humble, isolated communities devoted to silence and simplicity. Architecture varied from stone cloisters to timber-framed halls, but all carried the same scent of incense, parchment, and devotion. Nuns, too, lived in similar communities, where women studied theology, music, and healing arts. The monastery was not separate from the world. It was its refuge, its memory, its prayerful mirror. And as your thoughts begin to soften and your mind drifts closer to sleep, imagine a candlelit hallway, a distant hymn echoing through stone, and a monk in a woolen robe hunched over a page, writing slowly, carefully, as if every letter carried eternity. Because for them, it did. In that world, time was sacred, and silence was not emptiness but presence. There is something about the middle of the night that bends time. When all is quiet and the air holds still, you could believe that the centuries have folded together and you are resting not in your room, but in the guest chamber of a medieval inn, warmed by the breath of a distant fire and the quiet murmurs of wind outside wooden shutters. In these hours, the walls between worlds grow thin. And so, we return again to the long corridor of the Middle Ages, where the flicker of torches still plays on stone, and the echo of footsteps lingers in vaulted halls. Let us gather 3 more stories, slow and strange, and let their weight gently guide us towards sleep. Fact number 31. In the Middle Ages, fashion was not only about clothing, it was a visible code of status, identity, and morality. The colors, fabrics, and shapes of garments all communicated who a person was and where they stood in the social order. Sumptuary laws, passed in many medieval kingdoms, strictly regulated who could wear what. Only royalty and high nobility could wear purple or cloth of gold. Velvet and fine silks were reserved for the wealthy. Even the width of sleeves, the length of a cloak, or the presence of fur lining signaled wealth, virtue, or transgression. Among the nobility, pointed shoes called poulaines became so exaggerated that they had to be tied to the knee to allow walking. Women wore elaborate headdress, horned hennons, veils, wimples depending on fashion, region, and marital status. Meanwhile, peasants wore homespun tunics and hoods, dyed in browns and greens, made from wool they sheared, spun, and wove themselves. Clothing also bore spiritual weight. Pilgrims might wear a scallop shell, crusaders a cross, monks a simple robe of undyed wool. To be clothed in the Middle Ages was to wear a narrative of origin, intention, and allegiance. Garments aged were patched, passed down, repurposed. A cloak might begin its life in a court and end it wrapped around a beggar. Threads carried memory. Fact number 32. The medieval calendar was shaped not by numbers, but by rhythms of sun, moon, saints, and seasons. Time was sacred, and each day carried its own meaning. The year revolved around the liturgical calendar: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost alongside feasts of local saints and harvest festivals. Days were marked by church bells, which rang the canonical hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These hours structured both monastic life and village routine. Markets and courts paused for major feast days. Fasting seasons like Lent altered diet and behavior. The agricultural calendar layered atop this. Planting in spring, reaping in late summer, slaughtering livestock before winter. Lunar phases influenced planting and childbirth. The zodiac informed health and medicine. Saints' feast days honored protectors of trade guilds, villages, or illnesses. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throats. Time was not abstract, it was lived. A medieval person moved through a year woven with meaning, memory, and ritual. Calendars were illustrated with scenes of daily labor plowing, baking, spinning, each task sanctified by its season. The past was not separate from the heavens, and the passing of time felt like a dialogue between earth and sky. Fact number 33. Education in the Middle Ages was deeply shaped by faith, but it also laid the foundations for modern thought. Monasteries served as early schools, teaching Latin grammar, biblical texts, and logic. Boys destined for clerical life began their studies as oblates, child monks sent to the monastery at an early age. Cathedral schools expanded access to education, and by the 12th century, the first universities emerged in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. These were communities of scholars who studied the trivium grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Degrees took years to earn, and debates could last for days. Students came from across Europe, speaking Latin as a shared tongue. Teachers used texts by Aristotle, Augustine, and Boethius, illuminated with commentary and questions. Women rarely entered these formal institutions, but many noble women were educated at home or in convents, learning to read, write, and manage estates. Education was also practical. Craftsmen taught apprentices, and oral storytelling preserved knowledge in places books did not reach. In this world, to learn was to approach the divine. Knowledge was not just power, it was devotion, humility, and the slow sharpening of the soul. And now, as your eyes begin to grow heavier and the images of stone halls, vellum scrolls, and flickering candles settle in your mind, let yourself drift with them. You are not in a hurry. This world of slow time and sacred rhythm will wait for you, as it has waited for centuries. There is a stillness in the memory of the Middle Ages, a quiet that isn't silence, but something deeper, a softness wrapped in the creak of wooden beams, the sigh of wind through cloisters, the slow hush of footsteps on ancient flagstones. As you lie still, your thoughts dissolving like ink into water, we continue our walk through this distant world, where time wore robes, prayers echoed like music, and even the smallest gesture held meaning. Let us pause again, in that vast library of centuries, and gently open the next 3 chapters hidden inside the folds of history. Fact number 34. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a blend of ancient theory, spiritual belief, and empirical observation. At its core stood the theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each linked to seasons, elements, and temperaments. Health was believed to depend on the balance of these humors, and treatments aimed to restore that balance. Physicians used bleeding, purging, herbal remedies, and dietary changes. Garlic, honey, willow bark, and rue were common treatments. Astrology played a major role. Doctors consulted the stars before procedures. Medical texts were copied in Latin and studied by scholars, many based on the works of Hippocrates and Galen. But there were also midwives, herbalists, and wise women who passed down generations of practical knowledge. Monasteries kept infirmaries, where monks grew medicinal gardens and cared for the sick. Surgery was limited, but not unknown barber surgeons performed amputations and treated wounds. Hospitals existed too, not as we know them today, but as places of rest and charity, where care was given as a holy act. Illness was seen not just as physical imbalance, but as a test of faith or a result of sin. Healing, therefore, required both medicine and mercy. Fact number 35. Castles were not just military strongholds, they were living, breathing communities. From the outer bailey to the keep, each part had its purpose. Kitchens baked bread in stone ovens. Blacksmiths worked iron for horseshoes and armor. Inside, great halls echoed with laughter, feasts, music, and counsel. Walls were hung with tapestries for warmth and beauty. Castles had chapels, storerooms, armories, wells, and guard towers. Servants, knights, cooks, pages, scribes, falconers, and nobles all lived and worked within these stone walls. Water was drawn by hand, meals cooked over open flame, floors covered with rushes and herbs. The lord or lady oversaw justice, managed lands, and offered hospitality. In winter, the air was cold and smoky. In summer, banners fluttered from the battlements. Defense was ever present. Moats, drawbridges, arrow slits, and murder holes reminded all of danger. But within, life followed a rhythm of ceremony, duty, and celebration. Weddings, tournaments, holy daysal brought joy and display. A castle was a world in miniature, defensive and decorative, brutal and beautiful. It stood against time not just with stone, but with memory. Fact number 36. Art in the Middle Ages was not created for fame or profit. It was a devotional act. Most artists were anonymous, their names lost, their hands known only through the works they left behind. Churches were their canvas, frescoes covered walls, and mosaics shimmered in candlelight. Sculpture adorned cathedrals, gargoyles, saints, demons, and biblical scenes carved into stone with chisel and reverence. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with gold and deep pigments, each letter crafted with care. Stained glass windows told entire stories through color and light, bathing congregations in red, blue, and gold. Every piece had purpose: to teach, to inspire, to elevate the soul. Even in secular art, such as tapestries and carvings in castles, beauty was meant to reflect virtue, legacy, or divine order. The process of creating art was slow, and sacred colors made from crushed minerals, brushes fashioned from animal hair, designs copied from memory or vision. Art was a window to the eternal. It wasn't meant to glorify the artist, but the truth. And now, as these images gently settle in your mind, of candles flickering over illuminated pages, of hands carefully shaping clay or carving wood, of stone towers filled with breath and sound, let yourself drift further into that long-forgotten world. You are not alone. The past watches kindly. It waits without judgment, offering stories not to wake you but to carry you gently into rest. Some nights feel older than others, as though the hours themselves are carved from ancient wood, and the minutes echo like footsteps through a stone corridor. The silence in the room is soft and deep, and the weight of blankets mimics the embrace of time itself. Here, in this stillness, the world slows enough for history to enter. It doesn't come with loud voices or flashing images, but with quiet truths carried on the breath of old stories. Let us begin again gently, as if walking by candlelight through the centuries. Fact number 37. Medieval towns were bustling centers of trade, craft, and communiphare, more lively and diverse than many imagine. Although life in the countryside dominated numerically, towns offered opportunity and movement. Narrow streets echoed with the calls of vendors, the ring of metalworkers, and the chatter of markets. Inns welcomed travelers, and churches stood at the heart of civic life. Town charters granted self-governance, and merchant guilds regulated commerce and quality. Butchers, bakers, coopers, weaversall had their places and regulations. Walls often surrounded towns, not only for defense, but to control who entered and who could sell. Annual fairs brought color and chaos: jugglers, musicians, pilgrims, and foreign traders selling spices, silk, and stories. Sanitation was a challenge. Waste disposal relied on pits, streams, or communal efforts. Yet within this imperfect order, towns fostered innovation, communication, and community. Bells marked time, rumors traveled fast, and life pulsed through every crooked alley. Towns were not just places, they were personalities, shaped by their people and their past. Fact number 38. The medieval diet was more varied and localized than stereotypes suggest. While the upper classes indulged in roasted meats, imported spices, and elaborate feasts, The diets of common folk were seasonal, resourceful, and deeply tied to the land. Bread was the staple made from barley, rye, or wheat, depending on region and class. Ale and mead were safer to drink than water and consumed daily. Porridge, cheese, onions, cabbage, beans, and root vegetables made up much of the daily fare. In coastal areas, fish and shellfish were common, while in forests, mushrooms, nuts, and game were foraged or hunted. Fasting days imposed by the church-shaped menu's meat was restricted, but fish, eggs, and dairy were sometimes allowed. Herbs like parsley, sage, and dill-flavored dishes. Spices like cinnamon or pepper were rare and expensive. Wealthier households might eat peacocks or swans served in their feathers for show. But for most, meals were humble, eaten with fingers from shared bowls, in silence or conversation. Food connected the body and the seasons, the field and the fire, the sacred and the mundane. Fact number 39. Pilgrimages in the Middle Ages were not just religious journeys. They were physical, emotional, and social transformations. People from all walks of life set out on foot, horseback, or by ship towards sacred destinations: Canterbury, Compostela, Jerusalem, Rome, carrying hopes, guilt, illness, or gratitude. Some walked to fulfill a vow, others to seek healing, penance, or divine favor. Along the way, they faced hunger, bandits, weather, and disease. Yet also kindness from strangers, moments of revelation, and bonds with fellow travelers. Hostels and hospitals lined popular routes. Pilgrim badges marked one's progress. Scallop shells from Santiago, for instance, became iconic symbols. Guides called mirabilia offered advice, stories, and sacred histories. Pilgrimage was often deeply personal, but also embedded in community. Towns celebrated returning pilgrims, and their stories were shared in churches and homes. Some never returned. Others came back changed closer to God, to themselves, or simply to the understanding that the road is sometimes the destination. And now, as your thoughts drift with the soft rhythm of imagined footsteps on a winding road, let yourself breathe slower, deeper, softer. The world of the Middle Ages was not just hardship and shadow, but also movement, resilience, and deep humanity. And somewhere, still echoing under starlit skies, the quiet prayers of pilgrims are carried by wind. In the soft weight of twilight, when the air feels neither cold nor warm and the world exhales into silence, history becomes easier to reach. Not as something distant, but as something folded into the fabric of now. It lingers in shadows, in rituals, in the ways we still light candles or close our eyes in thought. The Middle Ages were long, but not lost. They speak slowly, and only to those willing to listen with quiet hearts. So, in this moment, as your breathing deepens and your eyes begin to float, let's return once more to that dim-lit world and gently uncover a few more forgotten truths. Fact number 40. Tournaments in the Middle Ages were not just sporting events. They were theatrical spectacles, social gatherings, and sometimes outright political statements. Knights from all over would travel days to participate in jousts, melee battles, and ceremonial parades. These events could last for days and attract thousands of spectators, including nobles, merchants, and commoners. The pageantry was enormous. Banners waved, trumpets sounded, and knights wore elaborately painted armor and coats of arms. The joust, in particular, was a dangerous affair. Two-mounted knights charging at each other with lances, trying to unhorse their opponent. While chivalry was the guiding principle, the tournaments were also displays of personal valor, family prestige, and military readiness. Ladies awarded favors ribbons, or tekensto, their chosen champions. After the events, feasts and dances brought both competition and courtship into the same space. And yet, these events weren't always romanticized. Injuries were frequent, and deaths not uncommon. Still, the medieval tournament was a celebration of identity, strength, and spectacle. A reminder that for all their violence, the Middle Ages also valued ritual and symbolism. Fact number 41. The role of women in medieval society was far more complex and varied than often portrayed. While many women were restricted by patriarchal norms and legal boundaries, Others found ways to exert influence, wield power, and shape culture. Noble women could govern estates, act as regents, and arrange marriages that shifted political alliances. In religious life, abbesses led powerful convents, managed lands, and oversaw scriptoria where texts were copied. Some women became saints, mystics, or even military leaders like Joan of Arc, who led French forces in battle as a teenager. In towns, women ran shops, brewed ale, and passed down textile skills. Guilds sometimes accepted women as members, especially widows continuing family trades. Female writers like Hildegard of Bingen and Christine de Pizan offered philosophical, medical, and poetic insights. Laws varied. Some regions allowed women to own property or initiate divorce, others did not. But across all classes, women worked, prayed, healed, raised children, and contributed to the rhythm of daily life. They were not silent, even if much of their legacy was written by others. Fact number 42. Medieval transportation was slow, risky, and utterly essential to the movement of people, goods, and ideas. Roads were often muddy tracks, vulnerable to flooding, bandits, or collapse. Travel on foot was most common, especially among peasants and pilgrims. Carts drawn by oxen or horses carried produce, wool, tools, and wine. Merchants traveled with caravans, their wagons piled high, guarded by hired men. Rivers were vital highways barges, and boats moved grain, salt, and passengers between cities. Sea trade flourished along the Mediterranean and the Baltic, with ports like Venice and Bruges acting as international hubs. Ships were powered by wind or oar, and voyages were perilous storms. Pirates and navigation errors were constant threats. Still, the movement never stopped. Messengers carried royal decrees. Students journeyed between universities. Relics were transported between monasteries. Travel was not easy, but it was fundamental. Every footprint and wheel track etched into the medieval world told a story of connection, of necessity, of purpose. And now, as your thoughts drift like a slow-moving boat on a moonlit river, you might feel the rhythm of hooves on dirt roads, the creak of leather saddles, the flutter of sails in ancient wind. There is no rush. The Middle Ages move slowly, and so can you. Somewhere between the hush of your breathing and the quiet crackle of unseen firelight, the Middle Ages continue to unfold, not as shadows or myths, but as echoes of real lives once lived beneath the same sky you now sleep under. Let us continue walking gently across this ancient landscape, with feet that leave no marks and thoughts that stir only like mist. There is still more to discover in this long-forgotten world, still more to remember. Fact number 43. Music in the Middle Ages was more than art. It was structure, worship, and memory. In monasteries, chants filled the early hours, rising with the smoke of incense into vaulted ceilings. Gregorian chant, the most famous form, was sung in unison without instruments. Its calm tones designed to elevate the soul and synchronize the mind with divine rhythms. Outside the monasteries, music blossomed in courts and villages. Troubadours and minstrels sang ballads of love, loss, and legend. They played lyres, flutes, drums, and early fiddles, and their songs passed stories from town to town. Music accompanied births, marriages, harvests, and funerals. It guided processions and battles alike. The system of written musical notation began during this period, allowing melodies to be preserved beyond memory. Modes, not modern scales, shape the feel of the music, each with its own emotional character. Instruments were often handmade, and performances were intimate. Though the melodies may feel unfamiliar today, the need they answered was the same: to connect, to remember, to feel. Fact number 44. Education in the Middle Ages was a privilege, but not an impossibility. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved and taught Latin literacy, biblical knowledge, and philosophy. Boys who excelled could continue to universities, the first of which, Bologna, Paris. Oxford emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries. These were not modern institutions, but they taught the liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Debate was central, and students trained to argue both sides of an issue. Degrees took years and required oral examinations. Professors read aloud from rare books which students copied by hand. Though few girls received formal education, convents often taught noble women reading, writing, and some Latin. Practical knowledge, however, was passed through apprenticeships, oral storytelling, and family tradition. Every mason, midwife, and miller carried generations of skill in their hands. Education was not always on parchment, it lived in practice, prayer, and repetition. Fact number 45. Superstition in the Middle Ages was not a mark of ignorance, it was a system of meaning in an unpredictable world. People believed in signs, omens, and protective rituals because the line between natural and supernatural felt thin. A sudden illness might be blamed on the evil eye. A strange birth could signal divine displeasure. Amulets, prayers, and charms guarded against harm. The church condemned many folk practices, but also offered saints, relics, and blessings as sacred alternatives. Astrology guided decisions about marriage, travel, and medicine. Dreams were interpreted as messages. Bells were rung during storms to drive away spirits. Cats, especially black ones, were seen with suspicion, and eclipses could terrify entire towns. But within this web of belief, there was comfort. Superstition offered explanation when reason faltered. It gave people tools to feel less helpless. And now, as your thoughts drift into the space between reason and wonder, you might imagine the flicker of candlelight across a page of music, the sound of distant footsteps in a stone cloister, or the silence of a village holding its breath during a full moon. The Middle Ages were not just what happened, they were how people made sense of what happened. And that sense, fragile and sacred, still speaks in the quiet. Time thins as we go deeper. The world of the Middle Ages, once distant and unfamiliar, now feels close, like a memory you never made, but somehow still remember. Maybe it's the soft creak of wood, or the chill of stone under bare feet, or the flicker of a torch as it dies in a corridor older than memory. As your breathing slows and your body lets go of the day, let's drift further down this candlelit path, through fact and feeling, through shadow and story. Fact number 46. Medieval justice was a strange blend of law, tradition, and belief. Court systems varied. Wildlife lords held court in their own territories, bishops oversaw ecclesiastical matters, and kings established royal justice, especially for crimes like treason or highway robbery. But beyond formal law, many disputes were settled by ordeal. In trial by fire, the accused might carry hot iron or place their hand in flame. If the wound healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. Trial by water meant being thrown into a river. Sinking was a sign of purity, floating a sign of guilt. These rituals were believed to reveal divine judgment. Oaths and character witnesses also played a role, especially in rural courts where literacy was rare. Public punishments like stocks, whipping, or branding served as both penalty and deterrent. Yet not all justice was brutal. In towns, arbitration and negotiation often prevented escalation. Compensation, not vengeance, was sometimes the goal. The concept of justice was inseparable from the divine, from community, and from a deep desire to keep order in a chaotic world. Fact number 47. Hospitals in the Middle Ages were not merely places for the sick. They were institutions of hospitality, care, and spiritual duty. Founded by religious orders, hospitals served pilgrims, orphans, the poor, and the dying. They were often attached to monasteries or churches and operated under vows of charity. Care was basic by modern standard herbal remedies, prayers, rest, and food. But the intent was powerful, to offer dignity and compassion. Some hospitals, specialized celibate houses, isolated the afflicted, while others cared for travelers or women in childbirth. Cleanliness varied, but the idea of health was intertwined with the soul. Illness was often seen as a test or a punishment, and recovery as grace. The staff included monks, nuns, and sometimes lay healers. Beds lined shared halls, and altars stood near the sick so they could hear Mass. Though knowledge of infection was limited, the human presence at hands, soft voices, warm broth was the medicine many received. These places were often the last refuge for the lonely, and in their walls, compassion took form. Fact number 48. Literacy in the Middle Ages was rare, but treasured. Most people, especially peasants, never learned to read or write, relying on oral tradition to pass knowledge and memory. But in monasteries, cathedrals, and courts, literacy was a mark of power. Scribes copied texts by hand religious manuscripts, law codes, chronicles, and even romances in parchment made from animal skins. Each letter was drawn with care, and many pages were illuminated with gold leaf, intricate borders, and colorful illustrations. Books were so valuable they were chained to desks or hidden behind locked doors. A single book could take months or even years to complete. Latin was the language of scholarship and the church, though vernacular languages slowly gained ground. Literacy spread with trade, urbanization, and the rise of universities. By the late Middle Ages, more merchants, officials, and even women began to learn. Reading aloud was common. Books were shared through voice, not silence. The written word was sacred, mysterious, and powerful. And as your eyes close a little more, as the weight of history wraps around you like an old wool cloak, you might hear the faint scratch of a quill, the whispered prayer of a nurse, or the slow creak of justice being decided by firelight. These were the Middle Ages, strange, solemn, and full of meaning in ways we've almost forgotten. But not quite. We've walked far together, across moors and monasteries, down alleyways lit by lanterns, through halls where voices once echoed in Latin and laughter. The weight of the Middle Ages no longer feels heavy, but familiar, like an old song you've never heard but somehow know. As you settle deeper into stillness, let us finish this chapter of forgotten truths with gentleness and grace. Fact number 49. The concept of childhood in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different from today. Children were seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to household labor, and by the age of 7, often apprenticed, employed, or betrothed. Noble children were educated in courtly manners, martial skills, and languages. Peasant children learned farming, weaving, or animal care by imitating their parents. Toys existed: carved animals, dolls, spinning tops, but play was a brief indulgence, not a stage of life. Mortality rates were high, and families grew strong attachments with guarded hearts. Yet despite the harshness, there was affection. Mothers sang lullabies, fathers carved names into cradles, and festivals brought moments of color and joy. The medieval world rarely paused for childhood, but in rare moments, when it did, it left echoes of warmth and wonder. Fact number 50. The end of the Middle Ages wasn't a single event, but a long and silent transformation. Wars like the 100 Years' War, pandemics like the Black Death, the rise of humanism, the invention of the printing press, and the shifting power of monarchies all signaled change. By the late 15th century, something new had begun to stir. Gothic cathedrals gave way to Renaissance domes. Scribes became printers. Kings became nation-states. The ancient rhythm of the feudal world, of plows and prayers, gave way to exploration, reformation, and science. But the Middle Ages never truly disappeared. They live in our language, our buildings, our beliefs, in stained glass and bedtime stories, in the shape of our calendars, in the way we imagine dragons, heroes, and saints. They endure not as relics, but as roots, deep, tangled, still alive. And now, as your mind glides softly across this final threshold, you might hear the fading echo of bells across a stone valley, or feel the hush of a library untouched by time. Perhaps you carry one of these 50 facts with you, not for school or trivia, but as a lantern in your own quiet moments. History isn't behind us. It rests beside us, beneath us, within us. And like the Middle Ages, it sleeps waiting for nights like this, and listeners like you. The stars above are no different now than they were 1,000 years ago, when monks mapped them onto parchment, and sailors used them to find home. In this stillness, their ancient light glimmers across centuries, and you lie beneath them like a resting scribe beside his unfinished manuscript. The journey through the Middle Ages was never meant to be a rush of dates, or Battlesit was always about texture, scent, silence, the curve of stone, the weight of belief, the rhythm of bells echoing across farmland before dawn. This chapter, this slow descent into memory, is not about learning, but about remembering something you never studied. About re-entering an age where everything felt closer, God. Death, the cold, the stars, the soil. When the night was truly dark and light meant fire. Where the wind through a village square carried not just weather, but news, danger, and hope. The Middle Ages were not a void between ancient glory and modern brightness. They were a long breath held between songs, in castles where wolves howled in winter and kings slept in fur-lined beds, in abbeys where silence was holy and the scratching of a quill became a prayer, in fields where children worked, played, sang, and sometimes vanished before their voices changed. The world was smaller then, but never simpler. It was full of signs. A falling star might mean a plague, a sudden storm, a curse. Every flower, every birthmark, every animal at the window had meaning. Time moved in circles, feasts, fasts, harvests, death sand, each moment repeated like a story told aloud every winter. We measure those people now in years and facts, but they lived in rhythms, not records. They woke before light, slept when candles ran out, and told stories until they weren't afraid. You are one of them, in a way. You've carried their stories to your own bed, your own stillness. And even now, they walk beside you draped in wool, hands chapped, eyes alert, speaking a language that's gone but not lost. In this moment, in this breath, you are part of the same mystery. What they feared, you fear. What they loved, you love. What they dreamed, you inherit. Not in stone or scripture, but in silence. Let that silence deepen now. Let the stars wheel slowly. Let the story continue not with facts, but with feeling. There's a silence that comes only when history sleeps. It isn't the silence of absence, or of forgetting, it's the quiet you feel when something ancient chooses to rest beside you. You've journeyed through the dark cathedrals and fog-wrapped villages, past ink-stained desks and dirt-swept hearths. And now, without even realizing it, you are lying in the same stillness the Middle Ages knew so well. The kind of stillness that comes when the bells have stopped ringing and the bread has been broken. When the fields have gone fallow and the oil lamp burns low, you are no longer watching history, you are inside it. In a room of stone, on a bed stuffed with straw and sheep's wool, somewhere above, smoke coils from a chimney. A dog stirs by the door, and the stars mark another hour that will pass without interruption. Think of the hands that built those walls, their calluses, their rhythm, the sound of hammer on stone, day after day, until a chapel stood. Think of the women who nursed children by firelight, spinning thread from flax while lullabies drifted upward into rafters that never heard applause. Think of the quiet oaths whispered at night, prayers, confessions, promises to no one but the wind. The Middle Ages were full of noise, yeshants and battles and market cries, but underneath it all was this, the hush of routine, the music of daily endurance, a song without instruments, a pace without a clock. It's here again now, in your breath, in the weight of the blanket, in the space between thoughts. This is what remains when the torches go out and the history books close. The part no one writes down, but everyone lived. And maybe, just maybe, it's the truest part of all. You do not need more facts. You've held 50. You've felt their shape. What remains now is not knowledge, but inheritance. Not names, but echoes. Not images, but impressions. Let the Middle Ages drift through you now like mist over a river. Let them settle in your limbs, in your chest, behind your eyes. Not as a time long gone, but as something you've carried all along. Tonight, you are the castle, you are the candle, you are the quiet between two church bells. You are the reason history still whispers. Now the road ends, not with a gate, but with a breath. Not with a closing door, but with a flicker of light gently dimming behind your eyes. You have walked the long length of 1,000 years, step by step, without ever leaving your room. And yet, somehow, you've touched the chill of stone corridors, traced the shape of stained glass, stood beneath a sky too large for modern time. There's nothing left to remember now. You've carried the weight of knowledge, and now you are allowed to set it down. Let the images blur. The monks in brown robes, the farmers bent over fields, the weavers at their looms, the knights tightening buckles before battle. Ye quiet lovers, whispering in candlelit corners. Let the noise of the marketplace fade. Let the smell of damp wood and wool and bread dissolve into shadow. You've heard their names, but they no longer matter. You've seen their faces, but they no longer need to be held. All that remains is stillness. The kind of stillness that has no century. The kind of silence that was already here, long before your first memory, and will remain long after. Time is soft now, like worn leather or the curve of an old path no longer walked. There is no more then or now. There is only this, the sound of your breath, the gentle fall of your chest, the space where dreams begin. You are safe, you are warm, and you are not alone. The voices of the past do not speak to keep you awake. They speak to keep you company as you drift away. Let them, let go. Sleep, the Middle Ages are gone, but tonight they stayed with you, and that is enough. Good night.